In the year 1221, somewhere along the cold mountain passes between Central Asia and the Indian frontier, a desperate column of exhausted refugees moved slowly through dust and fear, their numbers swollen with families, wounded soldiers, and civilians who had already watched entire cities burn behind them. Yet what none of them fully realized at that moment was that they were about to face the most feared military machine the medieval world had ever known. Behind them rode the armies of Genghis Khan, the conqueror, whose name had already become synonymous with destruction across Asia, a leader whose cavalry moved faster than any force on earth, and whose victories had shattered empires that once believed themselves untouchable. Cities that resisted him had been wiped from the map. Armies that tried to confront him in open battle had been annihilated within hours, and entire populations had fled in terror at the mere rumour that Mongol horsemen were approaching. Yet on this particular journey through the harsh terrain near the mountains of Central Asia, the unstoppable momentum of the Mongol war machine was about to collide with something unexpected, something that no general in the Mongol command structure had ever truly prepared for. Not a powerful army, not a fortified city, but a mass of roughly 15,000 desperate people who had nowhere left to run and nothing left to lose. Among them were warriors who had once fought under royal banners, families who had escaped massacres in burning cities, and refugees who carried with them the final fragments of a collapsing empire that had already been crushed beneath the hooves of Mongol cavalry. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary and least discussed moments in the long career of the Mongol conqueror, because for perhaps the first time since the rise of his empire, the unstoppable advance of Genghis Khan's army would stall, and the reason would not be superior strategy, overwhelming numbers, or stronger weapons. It would be the desperate resistance of people who knew that surrender meant death. Before this story reaches its climax, a great empire will collapse in flames. A young prince will lead a desperate flight across mountains and deserts, and the Mongol army that had conquered half of Asia will find itself struggling against a force it never expected to face. A group of refugees fighting not for victory, but for survival. If you want to uncover more stories like this, stories where history turns in unexpected ways, and even the greatest conquerors face moments of resistance that challenge their reputation for invincibility, then subscribe to the channel and like this video, because the story you are about to hear reveals one of the most remarkable encounters in the age of Mongol expansion. To understand how such an unlikely confrontation happened, we must first travel back to the moment when the Mongol Empire launched one of the most devastating invasions in medieval history. At the beginning of the 13th century, the empire ruled by Genghis Khan had already grown from a collection of nomadic tribes on the steppe into a rapidly expanding military power whose cavalry forces moved across the landscape with terrifying speed and discipline. The warriors who rode under his banners had been hardened by years of brutal campaigning, trained to survive on minimal supplies, and organized into a command structure that rewarded loyalty, intelligence, and ruthless efficiency. Their enemies often underestimated them at first, assuming that nomadic horsemen from the steppe could never challenge the sophisticated armies of wealthy kingdoms and settled civilizations. But again and again, those assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. Entire kingdoms fell in rapid succession as Mongol forces demonstrated an extraordinary combination of mobility, psychological warfare, and carefully coordinated attacks that shattered traditional defenses. One of the most powerful states to face this rising storm was the vast empire known as the Khwarazmian Empire, a wealthy realm that stretched across much of Central Asia and Persia and controlled vital trade routes connecting the Islamic world with the East. Its ruler, Muhammad II of Khwarazm, commanded a kingdom filled with prosperous cities, strong fortifications, and a large population that believed its wealth and strategic location made it secure from outside invasion. The conflict between the Mongols and the Khwarazmian Empire began not with a massive battle, but with a diplomatic disaster that quickly escalated into war. A caravan of Mongol merchants and envoys was seized in a border city, accused of espionage, and executed under orders from local authorities who suspected that the traders were secretly gathering intelligence for Genghis Khan. When news of the incident reached the Mongol ruler, he demanded justice and the punishment of those responsible. Instead of resolving the situation peacefully, the Khwarazmian leadership made a decision that would soon bring catastrophe upon their entire empire. They humiliated the Mongol envoys sent to negotiate and executed them as well. In the world of steppe diplomacy, this was more than an insult. It was a declaration of war. The response from Genghis Khan was swift and devastating. In 1219, the Mongol armies launched a massive invasion of the Khwarazmian Empire, advancing across deserts, rivers, and fortified frontiers with a speed that stunned defenders who had expected a slow and predictable campaign. City after city fell as Mongol forces surrounded them, cut off their supplies, and unleashed attacks that combined siege warfare with psychological terror designed to break resistance before it could fully organize. Within a few years, the once powerful Khwarazmian state had begun collapsing under the relentless pressure of the Mongol advance. Its ruler fled from one stronghold to another, while attempting to gather surviving forces. Yet everywhere he turned, Mongol detachments seemed to appear with terrifying efficiency. Eventually, Muhammad II of Khwarazm died while in flight, leaving behind a shattered empire and a desperate heir who would attempt to continue the struggle against overwhelming odds. That heir was his son, Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, a young leader whose courage and determination would briefly challenge the unstoppable advance of the Mongol armies. Jalal ad-Din inherited not a stable kingdom, but a disaster. The once great cities of his father's empire had been burned or abandoned. Armies that had once numbered in the tens of thousands were scattered or destroyed, and the surviving population was fleeing in every direction to escape the Mongol onslaught. Yet despite these overwhelming losses, Jalal ad-Din refused to surrender. Instead, he gathered what forces he could find, rallying soldiers, tribal fighters, and refugees who still believed that resistance was possible, even against the most feared conqueror of their age. His growing following soon turned into something larger than a traditional army. It became a moving population of survivors. Thousands of civilians joined the column as it moved through the rugged terrain of Central Asia, hoping that staying close to Jalal ad-Din's warriors might offer at least a chance of protection from the Mongol cavalry sweeping across the region. By the time the group reached the mountainous frontier, near the lands that would eventually lead toward the Indian subcontinent, the column had grown into a mass of nearly 15,000 people. Among them were experienced fighters who had once served in imperial armies, wounded veterans who refused to abandon the struggle, and families who had lost everything during the Mongol invasion. They were exhausted, undersupplied, and constantly looking over their shoulders for the dust clouds that would signal the arrival of Mongol horsemen, because behind them, the conqueror himself was coming. Genghis Khan had personally taken interest in the pursuit of Jalal ad-Din, recognizing that the young prince represented the last organized resistance to Mongol domination in the region. Allowing him to escape would mean leaving a symbol of defiance alive, and Genghis Khan rarely allowed symbols of resistance to survive. The Mongol armies began closing the distance, riding across the harsh terrain with their usual disciplined speed, confident that the exhausted column ahead of them could not possibly withstand a direct confrontation. But the people travelling with Jalal ad-Din understood something the Mongol commanders did not fully appreciate. For them, this was not another battle in a long campaign. It was the final stand between survival and annihilation. As the exhausted column of refugees and warriors moved deeper toward the mountainous frontier that separated Central Asia from the lands leading toward the Indian subcontinent, the tension among them grew heavier with each passing day because everyone understood that the Mongol army behind them was closing the distance with the relentless patience that had already destroyed empires far stronger than the shattered force now struggling to survive. The leader holding this desperate group together was Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, a young prince who had suddenly found himself carrying the final hopes of a collapsed kingdom while pursued by the most formidable conqueror the medieval world had ever seen. Unlike many rulers who lost their nerve after suffering devastating defeats, Jalal ad-Din refused to surrender to the overwhelming reality of Mongol power and instead began shaping these scattered remnants of his followers into a defensive force capable of resisting, even if only briefly, the unstoppable momentum of the steppe empire. The 15,000 people travelling with him were not a conventional army in any sense of the word, because they included women, children, elderly refugees, wounded soldiers, merchants who had abandoned their caravans, and farmers who had fled burning villages while Mongol cavalry thundered across the plains behind them. Yet within this moving population were also several thousand determined fighters who had once served in the armies of the Khwarazmian Empire and who understood that if the Mongols caught them in open terrain, the result would almost certainly be annihilation. Jalal ad-Din therefore began searching for terrain that might offer even the smallest advantage against a force that normally dominated the battlefield through mobility, speed, and the terrifying coordination of mounted archers capable of surrounding and destroying enemies with surgical precision. The land they entered was rugged and unforgiving, filled with steep ridges, narrow passes and rocky slopes where large cavalry formations could not easily maneuver in the sweeping movements that made Mongol tactics so devastating in open plains. It was here, in this harsh landscape where every path seemed to twist through cliffs and valleys, that Jalal ad-Din made the decision to stop running and prepare for the confrontation that everyone knew was coming. Behind them, the pursuing army of Genghis Khan was advancing with the calm confidence of a force that he had never known defeat in a conventional battle since the rise of the Mongol Empire. For years, Mongol generals had crushed armies many times larger than their own by exploiting speed, discipline, and psychological warfare that shattered the morale of enemies long before the fighting even began. Cities that resisted were destroyed as warnings to others, entire populations were displaced or massacred, and the legend of Mongol invincibility spread faster than the cavalry that carried it across Asia. Yet the situation facing the Mongols in this moment was strangely different from the battles they had fought before. Instead of confronting a traditional army organised in neat formations with clear supply lines and predictable strategies, they were approaching a desperate population that had already lost everything and therefore had no reason to retreat further. When the Mongol scouts finally located Jalal ad-Din's position, they discovered a defensive arrangement that forced the approaching cavalry into terrain where their usual advantages would be sharply reduced. Narrow passes limited the ability of horse archers to encircle their opponents. Rocky slopes slowed down charges, and the refugees themselves had been organised in ways that helped protect the fighting corps of Jalal ad-Din's remaining warriors. The battle that followed would become known to historians as the Battle of Parwan, one of the rare moments when Mongol forces encountered resistance that genuinely disrupted their expectation of effortless victory. When the fighting began, Jalal ad-Din's forces used the terrain to prevent Mongol cavalry from executing their famous encirclement maneuvers, forcing them instead into repeated frontal assaults against defenders who were determined to hold their ground at any cost. The refugees themselves played a role that Mongol commanders had likely never anticipated, because they helped move supplies, shield wounded fighters, and create obstacles that slowed the advance of the attackers. For the Mongols, who were accustomed to breaking enemy formations quickly through speed and terror, the battle became an exhausting struggle in which their opponents refused to collapse even after suffering heavy losses. The defenders fought with the desperation of people who knew that defeat meant not simply losing a battle, but facing the destruction of their families and the final extinction of the empire they had once served. Hour after hour, the fighting continued as Mongol commanders attempted to adapt their tactics to the unforgiving terrain, launching waves of attacks that would normally shatter conventional armies, but now met resistance from fighters who had nothing left to lose. At several moments during the battle, Mongol forces were reportedly pushed back from key positions, something that rarely happened during the campaigns of Genghis Khan, and which deeply surprised the commanders overseeing the assault. The determination of Jalal ad-Din's warriors and the support provided by the refugees behind them created a defensive resilience that disrupted the rhythm of Mongol warfare and forced the attackers into a prolonged engagement they had not expected. Eventually, the Mongol forces withdrew from the immediate battlefield, marking a moment that many historians interpret as one of the rare tactical setbacks suffered by the Mongol war machine during its early period of expansion. For Jalal ad-Din and the 15,000 people who had resisted the advance, the battle represented a stunning and temporary triumph against an enemy whose reputation for invincibility had already spread across continents. News of the encounter quickly reached Genghis Khan himself, who reportedly reacted with both anger and fascination at the fact that a force composed partly of refugees had managed to disrupt the momentum of his pursuing army. But even in victory, Jalal ad-Din understood the harsh reality of his situation. The Mongol Empire was far too powerful for a single battlefield success to change the overall balance of power across Central Asia. The surviving refugees and warriors therefore resumed their journey southward, hoping to escape the full weight of Mongol retaliation by reaching the lands beyond the mountains. Unfortunately for them, internal divisions soon began to weaken the fragile unity that had allowed them to resist so effectively. Disputes over loot, leadership, and tribal loyalties broke out among the different factions within Jalal ad-Din's followers, gradually eroding the discipline that had helped them stand against the Mongol assault. These divisions ultimately scattered the coalition that had once fought together at Parwan, leaving Jalal ad-Din once again exposed to the relentless pursuit of the Mongol armies. The chase continued until the dramatic moment when Jalal ad-Din reached the banks of the Indus River, where the pursuing Mongol forces finally caught up with him in another fierce confrontation. According to historical accounts, when defeat became inevitable during that battle, Jalal ad-Din performed an act so daring that it astonished even his enemies. Rather than surrender to the Mongols, he reportedly rode his horse directly into the rushing waters of the Indus River and escaped across the current while Mongol warriors watched from the shore. The spectacle impressed Genghis Khan so much that he is said to have forbidden his archers from shooting at the fleeing prince, reportedly remarking that a father should be proud to have such a son. Jalal ad-Din survived that day and continued resisting Mongol power for several more years, though the empire his father had once ruled was already gone. Yet the stand made by his followers during the earlier battle remained an extraordinary reminder that even the most unstoppable armies in history could be challenged when desperate people chose to resist rather than surrender. The moment when 15,000 refugees helped halt the advance of the Mongol army revealed something important about the nature of conquest and power. Even the greatest conquerors depended on momentum, fear, and the psychological belief that resistance was impossible. When that belief cracked, even briefly, history produced moments that defied the legend of invincibility surrounding men like Genghis Khan. If you want to uncover more incredible moments like this, where ordinary people and desperate survivors changed the course of history and forced the most powerful armies on Earth to face unexpected resistance, subscribe to the channel and like the video, because the past is filled with stories where courage and desperation reshaped the fate of empires.